Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nature Live Online. I'm Christina, and I'm going to be your host for today's show. Now, if you've been watching the shows, welcome back. And if you just came across them, let me tell you a little bit about them. Now, Nature Live used to happen at the Natural History Museum in London, in the UK. But after the pandemic hit last year and the museum has to close its doors, we decided to keep bringing the museum, its collections, its stories, its science to you, to your homes. And since then, we've delivering these shows. You can watch as many as you want in our YouTube playlist. But we are really excited that we do these shows live, which means that you can send questions to our guests throughout the show, and we try to get through as many as possible. Now, the fact that the museum is closed at the moment also means that we need your help. We are a charity, so any donation from you is always helpful. Now, you can donate on YouTube, clicking the button that's on the right-hand side on the screen near the chat. And if you are watching from anywhere else, you can go straight to our website on www.nhm.ac.uk/donate. But yeah, I'm really excited about our show today. We will be talking to author turned fungi enthusiast Doug Bierend, and we're going to talk about his journey discovering the world of fungi and the social movements that are growing around it. He features all this in his new book, In Search of Mycotopia, Citizen Science, Fungi Fanatics, and the Untapped Potential of Mushrooms. Now, if you're interested about the book after the show, if you're already interested, you can get the book in your bookshops from the 15th of April if you are watching from the UK, or you can buy it online. We're going to post a couple of links on the chat as well. But without any further ado, let's crack on with our topic. Let's welcome our guest today. Let's welcome Doug, and let's say hello to him. Hi, Doug. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm great, Christina. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really, really looking forward to start talking about your journey into Mycotopia, about the social movements growing around it. But my first question today, Doug, is actually how you, a journalist and author, got interested in the science of fungi in mycology. Can you tell us a little bit more about that journey, that particular journey that you went through?
Certainly. It was a pretty unexpected one. I've been writing for about 10 years now, as a freelancer mostly, for various magazines online for the most part, and with an emphasis on technology and media and science. And for a long time, I think I was looking for hope in those areas as I became more sensitive to the degrading social and environmental conditions around the world. And soon after starting down that path of inquiry, I became pretty frustrated by the discourse around technology and the solutionist kind of mindset that eventually I started to see as sort of faulty, that we might not be able to invent our way out of the problems that we'd invented our way into. So around the time that mentality was emerging, I also came into contact with a video that many people who get into mushrooms have seen, called 6 Ways Mushrooms Can Save the World. And it's by a very popular mycologist named Paul Stamets. It lays out in a really compelling way these sort of myco applications, the idea that you can clean up oil spills with fungi, or decontaminate polluted waterways, build all sorts of new sustainable materials and close agricultural waste loops, and all very promising and exciting stuff that just instantly hooked me and started me down the path, essentially, into writing about food and writing about fungi and these communities that are emerging around it. Because shortly after becoming interested, I encountered people from what's called, in some circles, the mycelium underground here in the US. And it's documented in the book, this sort of diverse community of people who are taking fungi up as an opportunity to talk about broader issues than just mushrooms or solving specific problems, but actually as an opportunity to maybe address the deeper social and environmental kind of concepts that that are leading us into trouble these days.
Absolutely. And that is a really interesting journey. And I think some people might feel connected to that, might feel similarly. Some people might be here just for the mushrooms. But I think you have already put the seeds down of all the topics that we're going to be talking about it too. Because after all, this is about, the book is about how you discovered all these of this a new world. But Doug, in case some people are not familiar with fungi and mycology in general, can you let them know a little bit more about these organisms, how they are everywhere and how they're important, aside from being in the vegetable aisle when we go shopping and just have them as something that we can cite on the side? What roles do they have in the natural world?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that could be an entire book or a series of books unto itself, and yeah, I mean, even in that question, I think there's some signal that we don't really know about fungi, because we do sort of lump them in with vegetables, and we think of them as something we encounter in the vegetable aisle. But of course, they're a completely different kingdom. They are, I mean, I've been in the habit lately of pointing out that if you walk into the woods and you don't notice the plants or you don't notice the animals, then you're really not appreciating what you're looking at. And fungi are no less fundamental, no less diverse or widespread. They're just as critical, and in some analyses more critical. As far as supporting entire ecosystems, they are in every plant in some form or another. They either entangle with the roots and form relationships between neighboring trees and other organisms in the soil, or they live within the cells of plants themselves. They live within our bodies and are part of massively diverse communities of microbes that actually account for more of our cellular volume, as I understand it, than our own cells do. So I think discovering fungi means discovering the contingency of everything that's alive, and a lot of the connections between all of us are mediated by fungi. And yeah, it's really the sort of thing that once you pull the thread, it just takes you through the entire tapestry of life. Fungi are there connecting it, and on the one hand, that's an important thing, I think, for us to recognize if we want to assess and understand our relationship to nature. But it's also just a wonderful, eye-opening, layer to be introduced to of the living world, and one that yields many wonders as you follow it.
Absolutely, and I think that links a little bit with what we're going to talk about today, the movements and how the social movements start growing around them. However, Doug, I think that even though they're everywhere, they're even in places that we wouldn't expect them to be, they're still a little bit mysterious and known to the majority of the people. Even they have a little bit of a bad rep. Why do you think that is? What that mystery around them, and why is that bad rep around them?
Yeah, it's I think largely cultural, because if you go to another part of the world, you'll find that people have a very different relationship to fungi. Certainly in Eastern Europe and in Asia, in China, for example, there's just massive production and consumption of mushrooms that puts anywhere else in the world to shame. Basically, it's a different cultural concept of fungi and what they are. In the West, so-called, here in the U.S. and from what I gather in the U.K. as well, there's a lot of cultural association with fungi as signs of death and decay, as though those are bad things, as things that can kill you, associations with demons and the devil, fairy rings, for instance, are sometimes considered gateways to hell, or at least in like folklore, we're sort of seen that way. So I think some of that carries through, and also I think perception that a lot of people have of cultures that have those relationships to mushrooms, and that could be, an older South American tradition when it comes to psychoactive mushrooms, or it could be people's assessment of the current age of like hippies and psychedelia, and a sort of negative association that they make with mushrooms there. But of course, mushrooms are just the reproductive organs of fungi, and so mushroom culture is a sort of specific thing. It's usually based around what you can eat or get some kind of mental effect from, at least as we conceive of it today. But a relationship to fungi, I think, is something more broad and deep. And it's sort of like saying you have a relationship to plants or something like that. I feel like that's what the sort of new community is more looking at than like, I have a relationship with mushrooms specifically, but more like fungi generally, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think that the more you uncover that kind of like hidden world of the mushrooms, the more you start understanding how, yeah, that bad rep is a little bit unfunded, and yeah, we should be more aware of that. We're getting lovely comments from our audience, by the way, Doug. So I want to remind them as well that they can ask questions as well to you. I've got loads, by the way, but if anyone wants to ask any questions, do put them on the chat, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. But Doug, I want to start asking you the meaty questions of the show, because one of the things that you talk about in your book, in Search of Mycotopia, and one of the things I'd like to talk about today is the concept or the movement of social mycology. We're going to say that a lot today, or socially engaged mycology, or the social mycology movement. It is a movement to educate about fungi, inspire social change through the world of fungi, and there are loads of organizations and groups and communities that are part of these. But can you tell us a little bit more about it? Can you start telling our audience about what is social mycology? Who are these people, these communities?
Sure. I think, much like any part of an ecosystem you look at it, it's diverse and it's multifaceted, but I think there are some common themes. Obviously, they're all inspired by fungi and interested in fungi. These groups that I visited across the US and Canada, Ecuador, and also in the UK. There is a growing movement, as some might call it, to take the example that fungi seem to offer as beings that have lasted for billions of years in intimate relationships that haven't completely degraded the basis of their survival and the ecosystems on which they depend. I think there's right there a pretty handy example for humans to learn from. And that sort of message is, I think, what's being perceived by growing numbers of people who, honestly, I think the reason that fungi are becoming a part of the reason that fungi are becoming so popular these days is due in part to recognition that we're doing things wrong, that our systems are failing us and our assumptions are failing us and the planet on which we depend. And so, some of these groups are getting together just because they, like fungi a whole lot, and it factors into their land stewardship, or they see opportunities to grow food and medicine for their communities. There's a lot of local economies that can be kind of kickstarted by this growing interest in mushrooms. A lot of people are interested in medicinal mushrooms and culinary mushrooms, and now people are learning to grow them in their basements and in their garages. And there's a local focus to a lot of these groups, but a lot of them are also gathering because, in the context of mushrooms as medicine, or psychedelic mushrooms, psychoactive mushrooms, those have, as we alluded to earlier, traditional roots in cultures that are currently marginalized. And those communities here in the US, for example, the POC fungi community in San Diego, California, or unceded territory, they call it, they got specifically because there was an interest in fungi. There are implications for the contaminated landscapes that they face as communities of color in this country, at least, that there's a higher prevalence of contaminated land next to marginalized communities. So the idea of remediating a landscape with mushrooms has special meaning to that community. But they were looking at it medicinally for the most part, again, because there's all of this talk about decriminalization and therapeutic benefit and all this, a lot of dollar signs in people's eyes, frankly, around psychedelic mushrooms. And this is a community that actually has ancestral ties to those practices, but feels excluded from all of the activity that's generated around it. And one of them put it to me like, I don't know if I'll be able to afford a $500 session, at a clinic once this stuff becomes mainstream, despite the the cultural relationship that this person had to that practice. And so I feel like somehow fungi have become a sort of rallying point for broader conversations, and maybe that's appropriate given that they literally do connect, everything on Earth in some way, and there's always a fungal angle somehow, but that includes social issues. And I think a lot of these groups are forming as a response to conditions and inspired by mushrooms and what they suggest we might do differently to change those conditions.
Absolutely, and I think that you've said clearly a difference between these communities, these groups, that you could call amateur mycologists, but they're very, very different to the traditional um, mycology associations or societies that might have existed in the past, of people that weren't necessarily scientists but were studying mycology and fungi in some way. Do you see that difference there?
Yeah, I think there's a difference. I think it's mostly in the area of focus that they like. What are the conversations that they're having at these gatherings, and what are they really gathering around? The science of mycology was advanced by amateurs, and into its current still marginal state as a formal science. I mean, fungi weren't even recognized as a distinct kingdom until 1969. Prior to that, they were considered a weird little subset of plants, and the work to document them, which is still vastly incomplete, was undertaken by like clergymen, who had a hobby in the Victorian era. This was largely in the UK. And the outside of organizations like Kew and the Royal Society. There were marginal figures in that space who were kind of pioneering the field of mycology, but I don't think they were talking about the state of marginalized communities or the sustainability of the food system as much as they were just trying to learn about this set of organisms. And so nowadays, there's one mycologist put it to me that we're actually in a sort of Victorian revolution for mycology on the institutional science side, because technologies are emerging that allow us to document fungi in ways that we couldn't before, and they just aren't as easy to document as like birds or trees, because they hide. A lot of them don't make mushrooms. You can't see them unless you have advanced genetic techniques, but those techniques are becoming available to regular people, and you can conduct DNA sequencing with a device that you put in your pocket now. And so there's actual opportunity to contribute to the science of mycology that these communities that are also socially minded and sustainability minded are participating in. So it's almost an echo of what's happened before, but I feel like, again, maybe just given the time, our current age, we're confronted with changing things. That's part of the conversation now, and it kind of makes sense when what you're talking about is like an entire dimension of the living world that we're suddenly realizing we've ignored, and from which there's so much to learn.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you in all that. Now, Doug, we had a few questions coming in, a lot of questions from an audience. So I thought, before we keep talking about these fascinating topics, I'll ask you some of them because they are really, really interesting. I'll ask you one straightforward that was asked at the beginning. A couple of people from YouTube, they ask, what is your favorite kind of fungus? Or what is the most interesting fungi that you've come across? Do you have one?
Ooh, that's interesting. There's so many. The one that just leaps to mind, it's a little cliche, but it is fascinating. Are the cordyceps genus, and they're various species. They target different insects. They don't grow on wood or in soil. They grow out of insects, and so they have to inoculate them. And you'll often see them called like the zombie fungus, because the ones that target ants take over their nervous system basically, and compel them to climb to the tallest point they can reach, and then latch jaws and hold there while the fungus takes over, produces a little mushroom, and then rains spores down on the next victim. And it's just a crazy instance of refined evolution. But it's hard to it's sort of a famously difficult question, because it's like every single one of them has an incredibly fascinating ecology. The aesthetic qualities of each mushroom are just exquisite. So I could have given another answer if you'd asked me in 5 minutes, probably.
You give an answer of one of the ones that might give them a little bit of a bad rep, maybe because of some video games that are going around there. But on that line, Doug, Lily, who is 7 or has 7-year-old, oh sorry, Lily's son, who is 7, I would like to know how many fungi that we know are poisonous to human, and the answer is quite surprising, isn't it?
Yeah, and and I wish I had the exact number to offer, but from recollection, it's something like 3% of known mushrooms are potentially poisonous. Different people have different reactions to different mushrooms. I think it's a large enough percentage that you should always be careful, and you mustn't pick mushrooms with any intention of eating them unless you're with someone who's very experienced and knows what they're looking for. Some that look like edible, delicious mushrooms are actually not. And so I feel like this is a good opportunity to warn everybody that, I encourage every human being to go into the woods and look for mushrooms. But if you ever intend to eat it, make sure you know someone who can vouch for it. But yeah, it's always safe to pick a mushroom. I hope that people remember that. I think there's a lot of reluctance to even touch them sometimes, but eating and touching are two different things. And yeah, it's a relative to even the very small amount of mushrooms that we know of, because there are many more that have yet to be discovered. It's something like 3% from what I recall.
Absolutely. Now, going back to the topic we were talking about, Doug, I think you've already touched a little bit on this. You were talking about how the social mycology movement, you've already said that they are diverse communities. They step out from what some people might imagine as a mycologist, like a white old scientist studying mushroom, and that's really interesting. How do you make mycology something that might have been a territory of a white or scientist, male scientist territory? How do you make it this diverse and intersectional then?
Yeah, well, as a prescription, I can't say. I don't know how they've done it, or how it's happening necessarily, except that I think that these groups are forming around new centers that, as opposed to often white male-dominated institutions of science that have their proclivities kind of built in and backed up by decades, generations of practice, and those systems are hard to reform. I mean, they're cultural, they're institutional, and so I think the way that it's happening is just that communities recognizing their need to organize and to find one another have found a way to one another through fungi. And again, it's happening at a time when we're noticing that things are not equitable, and that certain people from certain demographics are more privileged than others, when it comes to participating in science. And so part of what was exciting to me about this is that the confluence of these conversations with the availability of these technologies, and just the interest that's sort of filling the sails all around, is creating conditions where a more diverse group of people are coming together and expressing themselves and actually having an impact on those larger institutions. And I think that's going to redound to more diversity down the line. Those institutions want to keep going as well, and they want to remain relevant. As science funding is dropping, they are going to rely on the amateurs, and those amateurs are increasingly reflected in these communities. So it feels like a kind of perfect storm of diversity making possibility. But it's, I can't say that it's that there's a strategy to derive from that. It's just something I like to see.
Absolutely. And Doug, that actually leads quite nicely with, radical mycology. You mentioned just is something that is local, is voguing for community work and equity. You've been mentioning all these words. So my next question is a little bit big, and it might be a bit tricky, but in the capitalist world that we live, how can radical mycology survive, and or how is radical mycology surviving and even thriving in some way?
Sure. I would add a caveat that radical mycology is a particular, it's a very handy catch-all term for this, and I use it a
Yeah,
lot.
so yeah.
And no, I think it's a good prompt for me to tell the audience that there are like various groups with similar or related outlooks. You know, POC fungi community, fungi for the people, New Moon Mycology Summit. I mean, they're all in the book, but these are there's a sort of suite of these groups. But radical mycology seems to be a nice sort of catch-all for it, because it does seem like mycological conversations are setting the stage for conversations about how do we build reciprocal, local, sustainable, non-extractive systems that circulate value rather than pulling it out, which is really the sort of dominant logic of our time. And again, that's reflected in the nature of these beings themselves. And I think that that's sort of the starting point for a lot of it. People in these communities and in these groups have formed a relationship with fungi by going into the woods, by cultivating them, by just studying them at a deep level. And in doing that, what I've observed is that it's hard not to emerge with a sense of the interconnectedness of things. And that's a kind of another catch-all term, you know, something that you can throw around really easily. It gets all connected, but it takes on meaning when you see that reality at work and at various different levels, and you recognize that subtle, vast movements of subtle, or vast landscapes of subtle activity create the world as we know it, and it just inspires ways of thinking that buck the linear extractive logic that governs the world on a more general level. So, I think there is something like there's some aspects to fungi themselves and the economies that are emerging around them that might have some subversive potential, like specialty mushrooms that are gaining popularity just don't travel well. So they sort of bias local, distribution, bias toward that, which I think is good. People are developing new ways to cultivate recalcitrant species that have medicinal value. And so they're kickstarting boutique economies that way that serve their community ideally. Some people are taking those developments and trying to create big businesses out of them. And that's another path. And so there's a tension there. But even the fact that there's tension within the community over those values, to me, is a positive sign, rather than it just taking the wheel and steering the whole thing. So whether it'll challenge capitalism in any meaningful way, I don't know. But I think inherently it represents a challenge to the logic that we can just extract our way to a better future.
I think it's really beautiful that it's not just the philosophy around it, the movement around it, but also the intrinsic characteristics of mushrooms that are making this becoming a community movement, a local movement, a movement that, yeah, as you said, and you put it in a lovely way, challenge the current status in we live in. But yeah, Doug, we get into the very end of this conversation. I think I could be talking to you about this for hours, and hopefully that means that you'll come back. But we had a couple of interesting questions from our audience that I wouldn't like to left behind.
Great.
And I have one final question for you. But Louise was asking. They were saying that they're fascinated by with mycelium and how the World Wide Web seems to work. So, what is if you can put it quickly, what is the most fascinating new research for you in this particular area, if you can choose? Because I suppose it's difficult.
Well, I would again, top of mind, I would suggest Louise look into Suzanne Simard's work on the connections between trees via what are called mycorrhizal fungi and the mycofungi rhizal root. So it's literally root fungi that connect with the roots of plants and connect them to one another in a sort of underground energy exchange that she and her colleagues mapped out in a very compelling way. And I think there are some like casual interpretations of it. You don't have to read the research itself, but if you look up Suzanne Simard, Simard, her research on the connections of plants, it's what inspired a lot of the conversations these days about the Wood Wide Web or nature's internet.
Thank you so much, Doug. And another question that also came from our audience, from Orben on YouTube. They were asking, can protecting the symbiotic relationship with crop plants help increase plant health and yield? You did talk about a little bit about this in your book, I think, and other uses of fungi. But is there a definite answer to this, you think?
Well, I mean, not that I could give, except to say that I think there's a good reason that a lot of these mycological communities have a significant overlap with permaculture communities, and the idea that agriculture should be conducted as a ecosystemic or ecological process rather than a monocultural or extractive process. And so fungi, there's a lot of gardening and landscaping applications for fungi, people trying to maintain the health of trees or improve the health of trees and soil, and just biodiversity in general by introducing fungi. And that's a universe. There are books on just that subject that I could commend people to read, but it definitely plays a role. And again, I think the level that I'm assessing all of this at is much more at the conceptual level of like, how do we assess our relationships to these systems and environments, and how do we adjust to make it more reciprocal and sustainable? And permaculture, fungi, and land stewardship is maybe the most rich zone of that intersection that I can think of. So there's too much to say on it, really, but I would encourage people to look into folks like William Padilla Brown, who's interested in connecting various circular systems like algae and mushroom cultivation and all sorts of other kind of agricultural dimensions that I mean, he runs farms with these principles. So he's also big on TikTok. So you might look him up.
Definitely look him up, and definitely check your book as well for more information about these people, the stories behind them as well. Doug, sadly we've run out of time, but I just wanted to thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us and sharing this with us. And I really hope that your book does well, because it's definitely worth reading and worth learning about these the communities around social mycology. And hopefully in the future you'll be joining us again to answer more questions. But I'm going to say goodbye to you now. Thanks again, and hopefully see you soon. Bye, Doug. And thank you so much for everyone watching. Sadly, we've reached the end of the show as well. We've overrun a little bit. I've been a bit nosy, but I really enjoyed that conversation. It was fantastic to chat with Doug. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed it too. So yeah, I wanted to say thank you for watching. If you want to delve more into the social mycology topics and all the topics that we were talking about with Doug today, do get In Search of Mycotopia, which will be released on the 15th of April in the UK. You've got the links on the chat. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much if you donated, and if you didn't but can donate, donate on the button on YouTube, or go to our website www.nhm.ac.uk/donate. We will really appreciate, and it will be a massive help from us. But apart from that, just let me tell you, the Nature Live happens every Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. and we have much more exciting topics and content waiting for you. Now, next week, my colleague Alistair will be talking with a photographer and an entomologist about really strange wingless flies, but do join them to find out more about them. And if you want to watch all the shows, you can go to our YouTube playlist or to our museum website as well. But that's all the time I have today. So I'm going to say thank you again and goodbye. See you next time. Bye, everyone.